This is the 2022 Ontario Winter Bible School. Our speaker for the third session is Brother Kitson Reid from Birmingham Acox Green UK Ecclesia. His theme this week is the hand of God in our lives. This is his third class, and the subject for our class today is Stand Still. Our reading was taken from Exodus 14 verses 1 through 13. I now invite our Brother Kitson.
Well, welcome again, brothers and sisters, to our theme, which we have been considering throughout this week in the context of the hand of God in our lives. And you will remember over the past few days in these studies, we were looking at God's people and tracing their steps and their experiences in Egypt, and to see how God, in his mercy and in his wisdom, would so engineer events for them to understand that God's hand was guiding them and showing them and teaching them the lessons that they really needed to learn. Come across, please, brothers and sisters, to 2 Chronicles and chapter 30, because in 2 Chronicles chapter 30, there is a very timely reminder, isn't there, as to how we ought to understand the real reasons as to God's hand in our lives. One of the reasons, 2 Chronicles and chapter 30, and we're going in just one little verse, in verse 12, just for us to get the context here. Also in Judah, the hand of God was to give them one heart to do the commandments of the king and of the princes by the word of the Lord. And yes, of course, that verse, I suppose, could very easily be taken out of context, but overall, the principle still remains, doesn't it? That, I suppose, is the objective, isn't it, really? And we see that dovetailing nicely, don't we, in the context of God's people there in Egypt. God's guiding hand. And in effect, it was quite literally to do that, wasn't it? To give them one heart that they might do the commandments. And we saw, didn't we, that how the first 3 plagues affected not only the Egyptians, but also God's people there in the land of Goshen. And God's purpose was to extend his hand and to work with his people, that they might better appreciate that they were to be separate. It's rather ironic, isn't it, that the chapters show us that the land of Goshen, in effect, was to be separate from the land of Egypt. But actually, that separation had to be extended, not merely geographically, but a separateness that would stem from the heart. Leviticus tells us that I have severed you, Leviticus 20, I have severed you from all people, that ye should be mine. Let's go back then to Exodus chapter 12. We've looked, haven't we, brothers and sisters, at the plagues of Egypt. The water being turned to blood, and the frogs, and the lice, and the flies, the murrain on cattle, the boils, the hails, the locusts, and the darkness. And now we come to the 10th plague, the death of the firstborn. And you will, of course, notice, as we illustrated, how each plague was to undermine the gods. And it's there again in verse 12. Those of you perhaps may have joined on Zoom this morning for the first time. Welcome. And so in Exodus chapter 12, there is this new beginning. And the Lord spake unto Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be unto you the beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Prior to this month was the seventh month of the calendar year, from what I could understand, brothers and sisters. And it's rather like me saying to you, from now on, July will be January. And so this month, the beginning of months, we won't go there, but in Deuteronomy chapter 16, the opening verses, it tells us it is the month Abib, or the month Nisan. The month Abib means ripening corn. Nisan means to set out on a journey. In the Septuagint, it turns Abib into the months of the new things, where the tender shoots would spring forth from the ground. Why, it was a new beginning, brothers and sisters. And that, I suppose, in verse 1 is very much an index, a cameo picture as to the whole chapter itself. It was to be a new beginning in God's plan and purpose with God's people. Well, we said that right at the very beginning of our early talks, didn't we? It begins with creation, Genesis. The last 5 words, in a coffin in Egypt, take my bones hence, a death in hope. And Exodus chapter 1 is movement. It is a resurrection. And Exodus chapter 1 begins again. This wonderful process, doesn't it? The midwives. And the language in Genesis chapter 1 is very typical of Genesis chapter 1, that they were fruitful and that they multiplied to the extent where the Egyptians were getting very startled about the fact that there was an increase of babies, and the midwives were almost getting into trouble, and God blesses them, doesn't he? And here again is a new beginning, a new order of things, the first month of the year. And we ought to choose now a lamb or a kid of the first year. Choose it upon the 10th day, lay it up until the 14th day at even, and then slay it. I understand, brothers and sisters, that this Passover lamb that was chosen would have been taken into the family. And for that period of time, they would see if there was anything that was amiss within this lamb, any spot or blemish, it would be seen. There was the idea, history tells us, that possibly the children would take this lamb right into their very family living and life. They would play with it. It would become a part and parcel of the family. And on the 14th day, it was slain. And then in a very real way, the sense of loss of this creature, which had become an integral part of their family, they would have to kill it. And they would have to take its blood and put it upon the doorpost and upon the door lintel. And the feelings of loss, and how to explain it to the children, and how it would have made the whole family feel that there was something deeper that God would want them to understand. And they were to eat it with bitter herbs to remind them of the bitter. And the Jews today in the Passover, they have the 4 goblets, the 4 cups of wine, and they have the horosheth, and they have the salt water to remind them of the Red Sea and to remind them of their tears and all the things that represent that they would remember They would have the Haggadah, which they have today, which part of the ceremony is the showing forth. And when your children shall say unto you, it's there, brothers and sisters, in verse 26, it is the Haggadah. And when your children shall say unto you, Father, what meaneth these things? Ye shall say, it is a sacrifice of the Lord's Passover. And then it would be important then for the head of the home to recount again the whys and the wherefores and what it meant. Look at verse 11. And thus shall you eat it, with your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand, and you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. Now then, this was a time to be ready. Your loins girded, your shoes on your feet, your staff in your hand. This now, brothers and sisters, this Passover meal was to be a catalyst to propel them forward in faith. So why was it called the Passover? Why, brothers and sisters, was it called the Passover? Well, obviously so, because God would pass over. But in focusing on that, I wonder if we perhaps miss an element which we need to think about. Verse 12, I will pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite. Now we see the contrast. And in highlighting the contrast, the point is made forcibly. God would pass over his people, but he would pass through to smite the Egyptians. I will pass through the land of Egypt this night and will smite all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. I am the Lord. And the blood shall be to you for a token upon the houses where ye are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be upon you to destroy you when I smite the land of Egypt. And this day shall be unto you for a memorial. The word there is anesthesia. For you to remember. Now you see the word here. When we have amnesia, is when we forget. Amnesia is when we remember. And you shall keep it a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. Notice, brothers and sisters, that here in these few verses, verse 4, it was a meal of fellowship, wasn't it? And if the household be too little for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next unto his house take it according to the number of the souls, every man according. So they had to share it. It was a meal of fellowship. In these various houses, and yet coming together as a congregation, together as one in fellowship. And the thing, brothers and sisters, the thing that bound them together was the blood of the Lamb. We know in this chapter that they were commanded not to leave the house. It was a household of faith, wasn't it? For they would see the blood upon the doorpost and upon the lintel, and they were commanded not to leave the house. They were covered by the blood of the Lamb. Don't leave the house. Stay within the household of faith. And then we come down, notice, to verse 18. In the first month of the 14th day of the month, at even, you shall eat unleavened bread until the 21st day of the month, at even. 7 days shall ye bear there no leaven found in your houses. That's important, brothers and sisters, to keep in mind, please. Back to verse 11, we're told that they were to partake of the Passover with their loins girded, their shoes on their feet, and their staff in their hand. Keep a marker there and go back over, brothers and sisters, to 1 Peter chapter 1. In 1 Peter chapter 1, we have the wonderful principles that are coming out in 1 Peter chapter 1. And verse 7, we talked about this in the week. In Deuteronomy chapter 6, it describes Egypt as the furnace of affliction. 1 Peter chapter 1, verse 7, that the trial of your faith being much more precious than of gold that perisheth, though it be tried with fire, might be found unto praise and honor and glory at the appearing of Jesus Christ. Verse 13, wherefore gird up the loins of your mind. It is in the battle of the mind, to the pulling down of strongholds, Corinthians tells us. All that elevates itself above God. Wherefore gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober and hope to the end for the grace that is to be brought upon you at the revelation of Jesus Christ. What a picture, brothers and sisters. In the Old Testament, they were to gird up the loins with their shoes on their feet and their staff in their hand, and they were to go forward in faith. And now we ought to gird up the loins of our mind, have our minds ready to be receptive of God's word. But there is something else. As obedient children, and I wonder if, as Peter is writing these words, guided by the Spirit, of course, if he's thinking about that incident we mentioned yesterday, you will recall, in Exodus 32, when Aaron fashioned it, the graving tool, the calf, which represented Egypt in so many ways. And obedient children, not fashioning yourselves according to the former lusts in your ignorance, but as he which hath called you is holy, so be ye holy in all manner of conversation. And what follows in verse 16 is a lovely study in itself. When the scripture gives you half quotations, because it is written, be ye holy, for I am holy. Leviticus 11 and verse 44. Verse 45 says, as Leviticus 11, for I am the Lord thy God that bringeth you up out of the land of Egypt. That's the context. And that's what we said. That's what we've been saying to our young people, brothers and sisters, throughout this week. We must allow Scripture to interpret Scripture. And if we do that, we won't go far wrong. That's the context. For if ye call on the Father, who without respect of person, well, is that an indirect reference to the death of the firstborn? What does it say? To the one that sat on Pharaoh's throne, to the person who sat in the mill. Everyone would perish. Verse 17. Who passed the time of your sojourning here in fear, for much as you know that you were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ. Now let's ask ourselves a question, brothers and sisters. What corrupts more than blood? I cut my finger. Immediately, the process of my blood coagulating. What corrupts quickly than blood? As soon as the oxygen hits it, and we may understand the process. But notice how the writer turns the whole thing upside down. For we are not redeemed with corruptible things as silver and gold. In our first session, we looked at a picture of Tutankhamun's golden head dress. 4,000 years, brothers and sisters. And they retrieved it and they cleaned it up. It looked as good as new. But we have been redeemed with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb, without blemish and without spot, who verily was foreordained before the foundation of the world, but was manifest in these last times for you. It's in the context, isn't it, brothers and sisters, of the Passover. Come back, please, to Exodus chapter 12. Sorry, Exodus chapter 12, verse 18. This aspect of this unleavened bread. So helpful, so illuminating. Those of you may know that we've spent a few days prior to Bible school staying at Brother Justin and Sister Abby's home. A number of years ago, I was actually privileged to take their wedding. And I remember standing in the kitchen, I think it was day 3 there, and Auntie Abby, dear Sister Abby, had made bread. And just talk me through the process as to how she made this bread with the fermenting agent and the yeast and so on and so forth. This soda bread. And we understand, don't we, that in order for the bread, for the dough to rise, there has to be that fermenting agent. And what is common is for the dough, which is the lump, a piece of that dough is pinched out and kept to one side. And then when that piece, that little lump, which is the basic form of the fermenting agent, it's going off. It's the yeast, isn't it? It goes off. And then it is placed again into the whole lump. And it is folded and kneaded back into that lump. And that little piece of fermenting agent, that little piece of yeast, as it were, has an adverse effect upon the whole lump And eventually the lump rises and it allows the bread to be taking on more air. And eventually, hopefully, you are left after the baking process where that piece of bread rises because of the air. And it's soft and light. So with that principle in mind, brothers and sisters, come across, please, to 1 Corinthians in chapter 4. Because in 1 Corinthians chapter 4, the Apostle Paul underlines this very same principle. 1 Corinthians in chapter 4 and verse 6. And he's writing to the Corinthians. And these things, brethren, I have in a figure transferred to myself and to Apollos for your sakes, that ye might learn in us not to think of men above that which is written, that no one of you be puffed up for one against another. Verse 18, now some are puffed up, and as though I would not come to you, but I will come to you shortly, if the Lord will, and will know not the speech of them which are puffed up, but the power. In Corinth, brothers and sisters, there was pride. There was an overinflating of one's self. The pride which had affected the whole ecclesia. It is commonly reported that there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much as named among the Gentiles, that one should have his father's wife, and ye are puffed up, and have not rather mourned that he which had done this deed might be taken away from among you. Verse 6. Your glorying is not good. Know ye not that a little leaven, a little fermenting agent, a little yeast, leaveneth the whole lump? It's like that within the ecclesia, brothers and sisters. A little bit of badness, for want of a better phrase, that fermenting agent, once folded into the ecclesia, has an adverse effect on the whole lump. And it causes it to rise and to spread to the extent where there is no substance at all, no body to the loaf after which it has been baked. Your glorying is not good. Know ye not that little leaven leaveneth the whole lump? Purge out therefore the old leaven, that ye may be a new lump, as ye are unleavened. For even Christ our Passover is sacrificed for us. Therefore let us keep the feast not with the old leaven, not with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. And the Jews today, in part of that ceremony of the Passover, part of it is called Bedigath Hametz, which means searching for leaven. And there will be a little game in that household, you know, where a piece of bread with yeast in it, with leaven in it, the parents would hide it, bits and pieces around the house. And then they would take a candle. And when God says through the prophet Zephaniah, I will search Jerusalem with a candle. He's looking for the leaven, you understand? And that's what the Jews do today. In part of that game with the children, to impart in their minds that they might find pieces of leaven scattered throughout the home, to invoke the questions amongst the children. Father, what mean ye by these things? And then the story will be retold again. Come across, please, brothers and sisters, to Exodus chapter 12. And let's again bring our thoughts in the context of a new beginning. And so in Exodus chapter 12, then, we see again, don't we, this principle. The blood upon the doorpost and door lintel. Exodus 12 and verse 23. And did you know, brothers and sisters, in my reading, in my understanding, there seems to be two angels at Passover. Did you notice that before? For the Lord will pass through to smite the Egyptians. And when he seeth the blood upon the lintel and upon the two side posts, the Lord will pass over the door and will not suffer, second angel, the destroyer to come in upon your houses to smite you. And did you notice that phrase, brothers and sisters? The Lord will pass over. So we have this wonderful picture, this analogy of the blood upon the doorpost and the lintel, and the angel of the Lord seeing it. And that word there is, to pass over is the word to flutter or hover. The Lord will pass over the door, will pass over to flutter or to hover, and will not suffer the second angel, the destroyer, because of the blood of the Lamb. The angel of the Lord above the houses, and would not suffer the destroyer to destroy the firstborn. And we're right back to Genesis again, aren't we? It is the same phrase used, the same word in Genesis chapter 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth was without form and void, and darkness was upon the face of the deep. And the Spirit of God moved, hovered, fluttered, poised, brothers and sisters, back there in Genesis, poised to begin his creation. And so also, the angel of the Lord, poised again to continue his work with his people in their creation, in their resurrection, in their movement, as Exodus means. And as they moved forward, brothers and sisters, as they moved forward, did you notice in Exodus chapter 13, did you notice that wonderful phrase? So how do you understand and how do you picture in your mind when they left Egypt? I wonder. Did they go on in mass, just as a wave of people going? Were they singing? Were they praying? How were they set out? Was it with an orderly fashion? Have you thought, well, does chapter 13, verse 18 help you? I wonder. But God led the people about through the way of the wilderness of the Red Sea, and the children of Israel went up harnessed, margin by 5 in a rank. How about that for order, brothers and sisters? They went and marched in rank, in order. There was an order to it. Let all things be done decently and in order. It wasn't a rampaging, people just running away. Well, we know from time to time what happens when you have a crowd, a surge. People get trampled, don't they? They get suffocated because of the panic. There was an order. They went in a rank by fives. The number of grace, for by grace are we saved, in order. What a wonderful picture, brothers and sisters, of the saints. Going in the knowledge that God had been with them and guided them and protected them and done all that was necessary for them. And then we come to Exodus chapter 14, verse 10. And when Pharaoh drew nigh, the children of Israel lifted up their eyes, and behold, the Egyptians marched after them, and they were sore afraid. And the children of Israel cried unto the Lord. And we see the picture, brothers and sisters. So now they're leaving Egypt, and they come to the Red Sea. They have come to a cul-de-sac of life. It was a dead end. A dead end. In front of them was the Red Sea. Behind them was the Egyptians. But what was between the Red Sea and the children of Israel, brothers and sisters? It was a fiery pillar by night and the cloud by day. And as they stood before the fiery pillar, verse 10, here now the panic sets in. They cried unto the Lord. Verse 12, is not this the word that we did tell thee in Egypt, saying, let us alone, that we may serve the Egyptians? For it had been better for us to serve the Egyptians than that we should die in the wilderness. And Moses said unto the people, fear ye not, stand still. You know, brothers and sisters, in our lives, when all seems lost, when we cannot see the way forward, where there is heartache, and everything seems so confusing. Everything seems to be so at odds with what God has brought me to see. And I'm struggling. I am struggling, Lord. I just cannot make sense of it. Well, sister, brother, may these next few verses help you. All God says, Moses says to the people, don't be afraid and stand still. Oh, there's something else. And see. That's all they had to do. Stand still and see. It was as if what God was about to do, brothers and sisters, in his salvation All they could do there were nothing more than innocent bystanders. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord. For the battle is the Lord's. It's a lesson for us, isn't it, brothers and sisters? All we can do is stand still and see what God had done and will do for us. Stand still and see. Just be calm and breathe. Just breathe. Breathe, brother. And see what God will do next in his time. Because God sometimes wants us to experience things. He wanted Adam to experience loneliness. He wanted God's people to experience this life-changing moment. Stand still and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will show you today. For the Egyptians whom ye have seen today, ye shall see them again no more forever. The Lord shall fight for you, and ye shall hold your peace. And the Lord said unto Moses, wherefore criest thou unto me? Speak unto the children of Israel, that they go forward. So now there is a time to stand still. And there is a time to go forward in faith. That's the challenge, isn't it, brothers and sisters? To stand still and to wait on the mercy of God, and then to go forward in faith. Now we understand in the New Testament how the Apostle Paul illustrates this beautiful thing. We're told in verse 19, we're told there that the fiery pillar that was in front of them, so we had the fiery pillar, God's people, and the Egyptians. And the fiery pillar went from in front of God's people, between God's people and the Egyptians. And the verse says, notice, that the fiery pillar was darkness to the Egyptians, but it gave light to God's people. Notice that. Notice what it says there in verse 20. And it came between the camp of the Egyptians and the camp of Israel, and it was a cloud and darkness to them, but it gave light by night to these. Notice the position of God. It gave darkness to them, but gave light to these. Because God is present with these people. And what a wonderful thing, brothers and sisters. If we had time, we haven't got time, but those of you who are making notes, you might like to look at Genesis chapter 15. Because actually, Genesis chapter 15, remember the incredible experience that Abraham had? With the lamp passing between, and there was a horror of great darkness. Remember that? In your spare time, brothers and sisters, please make a comparison between the two. It is the cutting of the covenant. From Genesis chapter 15. And as it were, brothers and sisters, as the pillar goes through the water, there is a cutting of the covenant again. The comparisons are quite remarkable, brothers and sisters, with Genesis chapter 15. The horror of great darkness that would befall upon the Abraham and upon the descendants of his people. And it's enacted again as they pass through the waters. And then the waters close. And the words are echoed. For the Egyptians that ye see today, you will see them again no more forever, and you will hold your peace. And they saw all the Egyptians dead upon the seashore, brothers and sisters. It is a picture of what God would do for sin. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10, washed away, brothers and sisters. The Egyptians that you see today, you will see them again no more forever, and you will hold your peace. And they saw the Egyptians dead upon the seashore, sin, washed away. And just like in the days of Noah, the water which brought destruction brought salvation. And the water in the days of Moses, which brought destruction, brought salvation. What a wonderful thing, brothers and sisters. And then we have in Genesis, in Exodus chapter 15 and verse 1. Then sang Moses and the children of Israel this song unto the Lord, and spake, saying, I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. Oh, now look at that word. For he hath triumphed gloriously. The word triumphed and the word gloriously is the same word, gaha. I will sing unto the Lord, for he hath triumphed. The horse and his rider, he hath gaha. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. The Lord is my strength and song. He is become my salvation. He is my God, and I will prepare him an holy habitation for my Father's God, and I will exalt him. That's, brothers and sisters, that's where salvation ends. That's where it brings us, brothers and sisters. It brings us into fellowship with God. I will prepare him an habitation. What a thing, brothers and sisters. What a thing that is. And they sang a song, didn't they? And verse 20, and Miriam, the prophetess, the sister of Aaron, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her with timbrels and with dances. And Miriam answered, sing ye to the Lord, for he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. So notice then in verse 1, that's what Moses says. Sing unto the Lord, he hath triumphed gloriously. The horse and his rider hath he thrown into the sea. So Moses begins a song, and when he ends a song, Miriam begins a song, and maybe there was the way in which it was around, whereby Miriam sang and the women sang. Moses had led the singing, Miriam repeated it, and the other women possibly repeated it as well. And so there's this wonderful picture then of God's hand, which had done so many things. God's hand, brothers and sisters, in their lives. Notice what it says. Verse 4. Pharaoh's chariots and his hosts hath he cast into the sea. It's God's hand, brothers and sisters. God's hand which had brought this wondrous salvation for his people. May it be, my dear brothers and sisters, may it be that in our lives, when there is panic, when there is heartache, when it's difficult to see the way forward, may we simply stand still and see and see the way open before us, that waiting time can be very difficult. It might be quite impossible to see the way forward. But there will come a command, and we will know how to move forward in faith. And there's one final point. When the children of Israel looked back and they saw the Red Sea close, it was a final reminder that the way back to their old way of life was no longer open. Their way back to Egypt was no longer available. The way back to Egypt, brothers and sisters, was closed off. Impossible to go back by that means. Maybe that God will show us the way forward through the tears, through the anxiety, through not understanding what God has in store. Just go in faith. Go forward.